Good afternoon. Welcome to the colloquium of Thursday. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Sachidanand Sinha from JNU, who was my professor also, who was my PhD guide as well. So he is basically social geographer at the Center for the Study of Regional Development in JNU. And he worked in very different areas also, mainly in the social issues. He works in the area of access to the social amenities, particularly education, healthcare, housing, and related developmental issues among the socially deprived sections of population in India. He was a member of the working group for the 11th plan of UGC, working group for development of model colleges in educationally backward districts of India, Ministry of Minorities Affairs, and Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. During 2010 and 11, he served as a consultant to the Punjab Governance Reforms Commission, and later in 2012 and 13 as the chief advisor of the core group for development of school textbooks in social sciences for the government of Rajasthan. So today's talk will be on RTE, and it will be something beyond RTE. It will be very interesting and very interactive for fully. Welcome, Professor Sinha.
I'm really honored to be here this afternoon. I've forgotten the exact title, but on which I proposed a few weeks ago as the topic of my this is Beyond RTE, Right to Education, Political Economy of Accentuated Disparities in School Education. Let me at the outset lay down some of the broad parameters under which I'm trying to examine the developments in Indian education, particularly in the school segment. We all, if you look at the figures since independence, then one can say that, well, India has done pretty well in terms of the expansion that it has attained in terms of the number of schools and colleges. The government says that, today we have something like 1 million schools, and we have about nearly about 450 universities and about 25,000 colleges, which is an impressive figure. I mean, but then if we just look at it from a different standpoint, as to with this expansion, what has been the outcomes, and whether the distributive effect of this growth has been felt equally, equitably across social groups, across various pockets of India or not. Especially in the last few years, and especially in the last one decade, ever since, and you all must have heard about the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, SSA, Education for All. The reason as to why this mission had to be conceived was that there were still significantly large number of children in the age group of 6 to 14 who are outside the ambit of the school system. Today we are told, government says, and another agency which is ASER, that is Annual Survey of Education, which is carried out by Pratham, they are also of the opinion that perhaps there has been a significant decline in the number of children outside the ambit of a school system. That means out of school children has certainly experienced a significant decline ever since the SSA or whatever, the initiatives that were launched in different parts of the country. We really do not know, and there has not been much of studies to in fact isolate the effect of what SSA did or Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan did in relation to other social economic parameters, because the income effect will have to be seen. The effect of other factors will have to be also examined. But what is brought to our notice is the fact that in spite of these initiatives, uh, the, the learning abilities of children have not experienced any significant improvement. In fact, year after year, and also there was a study which was done a long time ago by NCERT. Several private agencies have been carrying out studies in their own way. ASER, that is Annual Survey of Education, brings out a kind of a, some kind of statistics on the basis of the learning performances or the performances of children, where they are given some kind of a test, so the class 5th child will be asked to read the text and do the mathematics of class 2 or class 2nd standard and so on and so forth. They do it in their own way, in their own, they have their own sample design on which, there is a lot that needs to be looked at. But nevertheless, considering that, okay, that's a kind of information that we have, what is the outcome? The outcome is that, children are unable to, in fact, read, children are unable to count, children are unable to add. With all that has been going on in this country for the last 10 years at least, ever since 2002 is the time when the SSA began, and 2009 is RTE. One may ask why it has taken nearly about 60 years or more than nearly about 62 years for right to education to be conceived in this country. And that is where the political economy of education is situated, and that's what I would like to talk about. Now, given this background that the right to education in terms of access to school may have been guaranteed to some extent. If you look at the annual survey of education statistics, not annual survey, that is the All India Educational Survey statistics, we have had 7 surveys so far. The 8th one is, perhaps the results are going to be made public very soon. And there you will find, some of the hard statistics which will be revealed, which will be given to you. And what we really see from the All India Educational Surveys is that the 7 All India Educational Surveys, because it tells us that the situation at the ground level needs to be examined from a different standpoint, not at the aggregate levels. At the aggregate level, one example of that which I gave in the opening statement itself is that the figures look very impressive. What is the political economy that I am going to talk about? First part of the thing is that ever since education started during the British period, we see a certain degree of continuity in terms of creating education for different classes in this country. We have never had a mainstream education system. Even after Kothari Commission's report, most of you as students of education must have seen it, several other reports which followed, the Plan of Action of 1986, which in fact is always quoted as the kind of, but that is nothing but the old wine in a new bottle. The basic substance of Kothari Commission seems to have been retained, and that's absolutely fine. I have nothing to comment on it. But the point that needs to be noted is that instead, where education could perhaps have been a force towards creating an equal society or moving towards a much more equitable society, it was used as a kind of an instrument to create a segmented society. That is why in this country, both in the government and outside the government sector, we have had multiple kinds of schooling systems. You can count them. We had what we call the aided schools. I'm starting with the aided schools because historically, these aided schools played a very, very important role through the grants in aid system which was introduced by the British. Later on, it was adopted, it was continued. You had the missionary schools, you have the Christian mission schools. You had the government schools. At the time of independence and 10 years after that, this is what constituted the main structure of Indian education system, especially at the school level. Then what happens? Then we have all kinds of demands coming in. Central school for some. Then the army school for yet some others. Then you would have the Air Force schools for some others. Then you will have this kind of a school, then the ashram schools for not so privileged ones. And what Kothari Sahab had talked about, that there should be pace-setting schools or trend-setting schools, which was translated into, in the bureaucratic terms, it was translated into model schools. So every district had a model school, funded by the government. So you can see the multiple kinds of educational institutions, especially at the school level. Up to the class 10th or class 11th or class 12th, whatever may have been the schooling system, we have had occasions to in fact encounter a situation in which you have multiple boards, you have the CBSE, you have the ICSE, you have the Cambridge and whatnot, and then you have the local board, and why not? After all, education is certainly predominantly a kind of a state subject. Every state must have the freedom, and the decentralized model is always has to be promoted within the kind of a democratic institutional setup that we are in. But then it really doesn't mean that we have different kinds of schools for different kinds of people. In 86, what we did, and mind you, if you can look into that, and if somebody has time, you may examine it, that in 86, as a consequence of whatever that was happening in the rural sector, the affluence, so-called affluence, whatever little affluence, or the income distribution or percolation of income that happened in the agricultural sector, the demand for a kind of a good education for the rural elite was also demanded. And that is where, the Navodaya Vidyalayas came in. And once the Navodaya Vidyalayas and the investment in Navodaya Vidyalayas began, the mainstream government schools started collapsing. You can just take a look at it as to how, there has been a decline in the mainstream government school at the cost of, say, some kind of a quality education that would be provided. This is yet another example of what we call the political economy, where the interest of a certain class has to be viewed and for which the government will have to pay. The government will have to foot the bill. Yet another, it is not only this. When the All India Educational Survey started, it's a very interesting story. And that again goes in the name of democracy, in the name of equity. That is, that villages will not be seen or will not be considered as the unit of observation. Normally what we say, that every child must have a school in the neighborhood. So much so good. I'll come to that also as to why this is a proposition which will have to be discredited. This is what our experiences have been like. And therefore, All India Education Survey used a different system of observation, a method of observation. If you are aware of the Indian villages, and most of you, or some of you may have seen Indian village, a typical Indian village, what is a typical Indian village like? A typical Indian village is like a kind of a conglomerate of multiple settlements which are physically distant from one another, where each cluster of houses belong to a particular caste, right? Separated physically from yet another cluster, which we can call, in other words, a spatial segmentation. That is at segregation. Segregation, by way of whatever sociologists would like to call it, is a translation of the ideology of untouchability onto space. I'm a geographer, so space for me is important. How things get distributed in space, right? And you can see it. And if you read a few interesting memoirs written by some of those people who had experienced untouchability, and one such that I can refer to if you are a reader of Hindi, perhaps it has also been translated into English, one by Om Prakash Balmiki Juthan, which is a story of Western UP. And you will see as to how there has been an attempt both within a school and outside to create a situation, and we all know it, as to why certain segment of India's population has always remained or has been always excluded from benefiting from whatever educational processes that are occurring. That is where one has to critically look at the All India Education Survey and the instrument that they started using. They used, instead of village, they used the term habitations. And habitation, according to All India Education Survey, is a cluster of houses physically separated from yet another cluster by a distance of half a kilometer, which looks fine that a child must have a school. Let us have a school in the neighborhood. But then if you are distributing something so thinly, nobody is properly fed. That is a problem. And that is what happens when you use habitations and not villages as a kind of an instrument of your inquiry. A couple of studies, I was quite inquisitive about looking at some of the experiences on the ground with the help of the government data. I'm basically a data person. I always deal with data, but I will not present the data before you because that would become extremely boring. But a few instances of how it really worked or works in a space could help me perhaps drive the point home. If we take, say for example, habitations as the unit of observation for locating schools, then a high caste locality and the low caste locality are likely to benefit equally on the basis of the norm which the Department of Education proposes. That is, that if there are so many students in the school, then there will be so many teachers. That again is also a very faulty kind of a norm on which I'll come a little later. But let's concentrate on this point. What has been the experience? The latest experience that I have with the 1910-11 data from 2 states, randomly picked up. I just picked them up because I'm little aware of these 2 states. One is Uttar Pradesh, where you have a fairly large number of children still outside the ambit of the school system. And the other is Haryana, where I'm told that the percentage of children or number of children lying outside the school system has declined to almost 1.5% to 2%, which I don't believe. The NSS data says that it is still in the region of about 8 to 12%. Because you can get your child admitted to a school, you cannot perhaps make the child attend the school because there is nothing happening in the school, what Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen calls it, the discouragement effect. You send the child to a school, if there is no learning that is happening, then the child doesn't stay for long. The child is always willing to play and also willing to learn. So to say that the child is not willing to learn would be wrong. So the situation is that you have a school in the high caste locality and you have a school in the low caste locality. One of the commentators of the Indian education scenario, Vimla Ramachandran, she has been writing extensively on gender inequality and several other issues in education. She pointed out that, distributive effect of how a school functions in relation to the people in that locality, that is not very important because, that doesn't seem to be having any significant impact on the learning performances or the learning abilities or the learning skills of the children. In UP and in Haryana, what we found, I went to the cluster level, each cluster having about 100 villages. it looks absolutely grand to report that all these 100 villages had a primary school. Right? So there were about, out of these 100 villages, there were about 114 primary schools. One can say, well, these 114 primary schools could be because there is a large village which may have more than one schools. Then that was a kind of another stage of my inquiry. Let us see where are more than 2 schools. Are those villages large villages? Then I check up with the census and get the figure of the village, and I find that there is absolutely no relationship between the size of the village and the number of schools in it. So that means for 100 villages, there were 118 schools. 18 schools were in excess of, so that means, there was one could say that one could be at the primary level, although most of these schools were co-educational schools, but one could say, okay, there could be a separate school for the boys or the separate school for the girls. I verified that also. I could only get 2 separate schools for the girls in that cluster. The rest of them, that means the 16 of them, were co-educational schools. Then what was the criteria on which these schools were located? And we all know that anybody who wins election, the minimum that the person would do is to start a school in his own village or in the neighborhood. Start a school in the village, put in 2 or 3 teachers, transfer them on a kind of a temporary basis, get the school running, then what happens? Gradually, in the next election, the person loses his seat or her seat, and then, this school is left unattended. And that is where you find from the government statistics that there are nearly 6% primary schools in this country with no teacher. There are 12% primary schools in this country with 1 teacher. There are 70% primary schools in this country with less than 3 teachers. I have not produced this data. You can check it out. It is there on the net. What does the RTE says? And that is why I am saying going beyond the RTE. What does the RTE says? RTE and SSA, what has been the agenda before these two? One is an act and the other is, of course, the mission, the flagship program of the Government of India, which has to be run in collaboration with the state governments. One was that, we have to strengthen the school infrastructure. Very good. Second, we have to see as to wherever it is necessary, we have to augment the supply of teachers. Without teachers, nothing can happen, especially at that level. Number 3, that we got to really look at a kind of a model of governance which could be decentralized, in which, there will be local participation. So, village education, school development committees or VECs, the village education committees will have to be instituted, which will regularly interact with the school and look at the requirements of the school and so on and so forth. We'll come to each one of them separately. First of all, going back to the habitation kind of a framework, where the high class, high caste, high class or higher class habitation, in case of UP, what we've noted, that the villages which had more than Haryana and UP both, the villages which had more than the required number of schools were not because of the strength of the students, was simply because of the fact that, it was created out of a certain kind of demand which was put forward by a certain segment of the population in the village. Our children will not go there. If they have to attend the schools, they should have schools here. Which again, in the year 1990 or 2000 wasn't a big issue, precisely because anybody who had good income was in any case not sending their children to the local schools. That is what I call another level of segmentation. One was the caste segmentation, and the other level of segmentation which has become so very prominent today is that the segmentation on caste and class lines between the private and the government schools. That's another level of segmentation. And where is the root of it? The root lies with the government instituted survey, which started defining village in terms of habitations. That is where, the villagers, until then there was no such demand. The demand was created by the bureaucrats themselves. And who were the bureaucrats in 60s and 50s? Those who had the best of education that they could benefit from during the period of the colonial rule. They were the ones who in fact managed the bureaucracy everywhere, And the class-caste association between the two can be very easily seen. So they invented a new criteria, and wherever it was necessary, they located schools accordingly. The criteria which was worked out was also very faulty, and that is where RTE will have to be critically seen. RTE says, and you can check out the act, in one of the schedules on page 13 in the Gazette, it says that the number of teachers, the supply of teachers will be based on the number of children admitted in the school. That means there will be 2 teachers if there are 60 students in primary classes. If there are 90 students in primary classes, all 5 classes taken together, or 4 classes, because the structure varies. In Bengal, it is class 1 to class 4, which is under the ambit of primary section. In Bihar, it is 1 to 5. In your state, I really do not remember. I think it is 1 to 5, which is in the primary segment. In Karnataka? Pardon me? 1 to 5, yeah. So you have 5 years of primary classes. That is the norm generally in the country. So for 5 classes, if there are 90 students, you will add 1 more teacher, because in the PTR that you have taken note of, that is the pupil-teacher ratio, should be about 35, less than 35. It corresponds with that. A nice kind of an arithmetic calculation of demand and supply, which really makes me feel very sad about this, the way, the departments of education, even the educationists have looked at this entire exercise of education, or supply or delivery of education. What is more crucial at this stage that the children learn? How would the children learn in a multi-grade classrooms? Have you seen the multi-grade class teachings? You have seen it, you have experienced it. At least I have personally gone across nearly about 300 to 400 villages, in this country, in different parts of the country, certainly not in the southern part because I don't know the language. But in the northern India, wherever I have been, I have seen that nothing really happens in these schools where there are less than 2 teachers. Because one takes leave on Monday, the other takes leave on Tuesday, and teacher absenteeism is rampant. One teacher has to manage all the 5 classes, so one has to, the task that is given to the student is that, you ये श्लोक पढ़ो और ये टेबल याद करो और बाकी जो है वो खेल रहे होते हैं या कुछ कर रहे होते हैं, which in fact leads to what we call discouragement effect. Please don't take me that, I am not considering poverty, I am not considering other economic and social parameters, which are also associated with education and educational access. But given that all these parameters are controlled for statistically, then what is the effect of teaching or teacher provision becomes very, very clear. It is not only that. As I said, 70% of schools, primary schools in India, have less than 3 teachers. That means actual learning in the absence of teachers cannot happen. The DPEP experience of your state, Karnataka state, DPEP first phase and the second phase, that the district primary education project, which was a multilateral funded project, Karnataka experience showed that wherever you had a teacher school, it performed better than the single teacher or a two teacher schools. So wherever there were more than 3 teachers, the actual learning was happening. Not only actual learning was happening, but the discontinuation rates also declined. That means if the learning process was on, the children would move from class 1 to class 2nd and class 2nd to class 3rd. Yes, at some stage, somebody would drop out. And I must report that even in the year 2013, the latest statistics of the MHRD says that by the time the child reaches class 8th, the dropout rate is close to about 51, 52%. 40% for India as a whole. For the worst of states, which are generally referred to as the Bimaru states, the Bihar and which I don't subscribe to the term Bimaru because that excludes Karnataka, and Karnataka also has a fairly high rate of dropout, which is close to about 28% at this level. That means comparing the entry point and the terminal point. Gujarat, which is as bad as Jharkhand. Jharkhand is only 2 points worse off than Gujarat. Gujarat has 46% dropout. So all these dropout rates, if you look at, you find that, there is an uneven distribution nevertheless, but what really becomes very clear that the aggregate level state figures conceals much of what that is happening at the local level, at the village level. And that is the theater where much of education, that is the theater, the school located in the village, which has to be evaluated as to what is happening there. What is happening there? The second part of my story is that the structural ratios in the educational structure is also weak. What do I mean by this? What I'm saying is that in India, in spite of our efforts, the number of primary schools per upper primary school is close to about 2.5 to 3. That means that is a structural ratio. Children who would graduate from primary classes would go to upper primary classes or middle classes. And if we are saying that we should guarantee under RTE that every child goes up to class 8th or attends school up to the age of 14, that is the corresponding age class 8th is the corresponding age for class for the age 14. That means what we are really talking about is that every child who enters schools, that means there has to be universalization of elementary education. That there should be no scope for a dropout, there should be a continuous flow, that the flow should be much stronger. How does that translate in a kind of a structure where the structural ratio is so deficient that there are 3 schools per upper primary school? Right? That is one deficiency in the structure. In Punjab, this deficiency has completely disappeared. Now it is 1:1. In fact, the number of upper primary schools, aided included, in Punjab is a little better than the number of primary schools. Because what I have taken into consideration here is that the primary schools in the government sector. In Punjab, there is yet another story which you can see, and that could be happening here, which I'll come to that a little later. But then what we see is that there are private schools in the primary segment from where children go to upper primary in the government schools. Also, certain amount of flow is there into the government schools as well. So in Punjab, it appears to be good, but in Haryana, it is still 2.5. That means the number of upper primary schools have not received much attention, right? That is a serious flaw in this entire structure of education. The structural ratios are poor. The structural ratio, wherever the dropout rates are high, are very bad, including Gujarat, which about whom, we have been, the state about which, a lot is being written these days, the success story of Gujarat. The fact is that at the education level, on the front of education, they have performed extremely poorly, poor. Almost in comparison to Jharkhand or in comparison to Chhattisgarh, one can say that Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, they have made significant strides whatever, and whoever be the power in government. The structural ratio is weak. What is the structural ratio at the level of the primary school and the upper primary and the higher secondary schools? In UP, for 108 primary schools, there are only 35 upper primary schools and no higher secondary schools. In that cluster, not a single higher secondary school. I am talking of Allahabad, the cluster that I had taken near Allahabad city, that in the government segment, funded by the government. Doesn't mean that there was no school, but it is in the private sector. Now let us look at the structure of schooling in the private sector. You can see it around yourself, and you can also see it with the help of the DIAS data now. You'll hardly find a primary school in the private sector. A primary school which is standalone, a primary, only dealing with the primary classes. They start with the primary classes and then they gradually go on to adding the upper primary, then they go on to the secondary and the higher secondary, because they move along with the oldest student whom they had admitted. Right? Most of these schools, the private schools, according to the ASER, the survey that they conducted, the private school children have performed better in all 3 R's, that means reading, writing, and arithmetics. One can say it is not simply the instruction in the classroom or in the school, but it is also the kind of a clientele that they cater to, which is absolutely fine, But if you control for the clientele, then it appears that there is something which is happening differently in these schools, which is not happening perhaps in the government schools. And what is that? I tried to find out, other than the governance factors, with the case study that I did in UP and Haryana. I'll report one small case study of UP, which I said segmentation. We took up 3 kinds of villages. One which were predominantly mixed village. That means, you had the scheduled caste and the Muslim population and the high caste. We picked up villages with higher proportion of the scheduled caste in those villages. We picked up villages where you had higher proportions of the Muslims in these villages. And we started looking at 11 indicators of education. What were these indicators of education? Number of teachers, how many times they received the development grants, utilization of the development grants, toilet, drinking water facilities, so on and so forth, for which data is now available continuously from 2004 through the DIAS. It is available also on the net. Village-wise, school-wise, information was collated for nearly about 6,000 villages in our sample. We categorized them in terms of, predominantly high caste villages, predominantly, and then, within the scheduled caste, we had 3 segments, lower than 10%, 10 to 25%, 25% above. Similarly, for the Muslims, because that was the minority that we had taken, up to 25% or more. And what we found that on all these 11 counts, the predominantly Muslim villages, that means if the proportion of the Muslim population in the total population of the village was more than 30%, then they were poorly provided in terms of schooling infrastructure. So the quantity and quality are not independent of one another. They are supplementing one another. Supplementing, and that is why I call it the deepening inequality. In case of UP, especially during the time, because the work that we were doing, that was the time when large number of villages where you had a significantly large proportion of the SCs were declared as Ambedkar villages, and they were being given extra grants. And you also must be knowing that there is a special component plan for predominantly scheduled caste areas, like you have sub-plans for the tribal areas. As a consequence of these interventions by the state, the villages with significantly large number of these SC populations started doing a little better. So it is not that a state's interventions do not matter. But what really needed to be seen was that, in spite of all these efforts, the minority villages or predominantly Muslim villages were still left out. They were a subject of neglect. That means the disparity between the predominantly high caste Hindu villages and that of the Muslim villages were enormous. Now, this is one kind of segmentation, and the other kind of segmentation that I referred to is the segmentation which is now emerging between the private schools and the government schools. Now, let us look at the private schools and the government schools with reference to some of the attributes that we saw. Most of the private schools, recognized or unrecognized, and that's another story because a fairly large number of unrecognized schools in Punjab have a significantly large enrollment. And you will be surprised, unrecognized schools having fairly large number of children admitted in these schools. How they operate? They exactly operate on the model of how quota operates. Quota has emerged as an important center of competitive examinations. So how does quota operate? You admit your child in the tutorial classes, and they will have a 10+2 school attached to it, where your child will be admitted, but your child will never attend that. Right? The child would be attending your tutorials in Akash or whatever. So that is what Bansals, yes, because that is from where they started. That is the model which works in Punjab. Because a large number of unrecognized schools are attached informally with the recognized private schools who receive a certain amount of fees, and most of these schools, most of the children are enrolled in government schools, but they are not attending classes in government schools. They are attending classes in unrecognized private schools. Now, RTE says that unrecognized private schools will have to become recognized, and of course, in India, they will always be a way out, So don't think that the unrecognized schools are going to be closed down. There are evidences that they are mushrooming and their numbers are likely to increase. Most of these unrecognized schools or recognized schools had a head teacher. In Punjab, Haryana, and UP, 90% of the primary and upper primary schools did not have a head teacher. So who is going to run the school? Somebody is made teacher in charge. You and me, we are colleagues in the same school. I am made teacher in charge because my beard has grayed. Otherwise, both of us are in the same cadre. But why should you listen to me? Because both of us are, tomorrow you become teacher in charge, then you will take care of me. So, it goes on that way. So there is no teacher in charge. And nobody listens to whatever that is happening. Nothing happens in that sense. The second is that most of these private schools, unrecognized or recognized, are basically integrated primary or a middle or a high school. So therefore, there is this, what we call this, the positive spillover of the number of teachers with whom they are working, right? Now, this is an important lesson to be learned. I think that way. I'm putting it forward for your consideration. That is the suggestion that I made to the Punjab government, and perhaps, they have thrown my suggestion into the dustbin because, it is not politically correct, maybe. One has to be politically correct to perhaps win elections. And this cannot help them win election. What is that I suggested? Depending upon the experiences on the grounds, because this is the right kind of a model in the private sector. The model is that you do not start a primary school with two teachers, you should have at least half a dozen teachers, irrespective of whether you have 100 students or 50 students. Because after all, every child as a learner is important. Not that it has to be seen in terms of the number of children, because then you are bringing in the salary component and the economics of supply into and therefore you are wetting the learning abilities of the children and their future, subservient to the economic rationale that you are putting forward, which will have to be overcome, which will have to be thrown into the dustbin, not the idea, not the experience that we see on the ground. And therefore, what I suggest is that that is the way out, that if elementary education, universalization of elementary education is the objective of the RTE, then this act can translate into reality only when you have integrated primary and upper primary schools. Take the upper primary segments out of the high school segment. So what you have the upper primary attached to the high school for whatever convenience that I do not know. I was trying to make out from the National Council of Teachers Education and their documents, and I could find none. There is no rationale at all as to why upper primary has to be attached with the high school. If you have the upper primary and the primary integrated, then you are doing two things. One is that you have the advantage of the number of teachers in the school. So even with fewer teachers, you can run the school better. The second is that you have the advantage of a better trained teacher, because at the upper primary level, you start initiating those who could have certain degree of subject specialization. My understanding is, and whatever little that I have been talking across, and unfortunately I had an occasion interacting with the teachers, teacher educators, who are working under the Azim Premji Foundation in Hoshangabad just about 2 weeks ago. Bhupendraji was also there. And whatever little that I could gather from there was that we need to have a far more specialized, trained component of teachers at this level, at the earliest stages of school education. And that is where, the advantage is. So we got to really keep that in mind, that how do we really benefit from this advantage? Integrate the primary and the upper primary. You will also see that the continuation rates are better, that, the dropout rates go down, that, the possibility of children staying for longer period of time and having to do, enjoyable learning becomes better, The second aspect, which will have to be also looked at is that, we'll have to bring about a massive change in the nature of governance. There is a lot of confusion currently. The Department of Education continues the way it was, and you have the SSA, which is headed by the director or the project chief at the state level, at the district level, there is a coordinator, and so on and so forth. Now, this has really created a lot of confusion right up to the village level. This village education committees, as part of the decentralized model, the case study of Punjab reveals, and the statistics are there, has resulted into one big gain. That is, that all schools have now got better buildings. Why they have got better buildings? Because most of the members of the village education committees have become contractors, civil contractors. And that is why the utilization of this money, this component under SSA, in Punjab is nearly 100%. Rather, in fact, it is 110% until the year 2010-11. This was also commented upon by one of the economists as to why is it that other components have not received so much of attention, but the construction, the civil work, is doing pretty well in Punjab. Civil work is doing reasonably well in Haryana. Civil work has of late picked up in Rajasthan. The story across is more or less the same. That there is good money for construction, at least who cares about teaching children? At least you can make buildings and earn the ready cash. The second important problem is that we'll have to do something about these what you can call it, variety of teachers who have been appointed under SSA. Para teachers we have been hearing about. Regular teachers we have been talking about. There are Shiksha myths of all kinds. Then there are contract teachers. In every state that you go, you have different kinds of teachers working in schools. There is no single stream of teachers. If teachers are not sure about their future, how are they going to really perform? And most of them, as in case of Bihar, are 40 years plus who were recently appointed. For 20 years, they did not do anything. They suddenly were appointed as teachers because, I don't know whether I should call it because Nitish ji wanted a good name for himself, That is how decisions are taken at the political level. And that presents another kind of a facet of the political economy of school education. So ultimately, how do I go about concluding? My conclusion is that unless and until even if we do not think in terms of doing away with the structural segmentation, at least we should try to bring about minimum level of parity across schools. And that can only happen when we have taken these initiatives. Mind you, India still doesn't spend more than 4% of the GDP on education as a whole. School education receives 1.24% of the GDP. That is less than the higher education, according to the 11th plan. 11th plan, we were more than 1% in higher education, right? And what is happening in higher education is something that I didn't want to comment, maybe sometimes later, because, in the UGC report, it is already stated as to what are the kinds of experiences that we have. Beyond RTE is going beyond the norms and trying to ensure that these norms are translated into reality, not in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality. Why I'm saying this? Because, there can be no change in the educational scenario unless and until we strengthen the local level teacher education programs. Our diets, the district institutes of teacher education, in most of the states, they are in a state of collapse. They have already collapsed in most of the states. I really do not know about Karnataka. But I'm sure of Andhra Pradesh. I'm not so clear about Tamil Nadu, but I'm aware of a number of Maharashtra. It's not working. Punjab, it's not working. Bihar, it never was there. So, yeah, Bihar never had diets. It had SCRT, but in Patna, and that is all. And Punjab has diets, but in grand buildings, but only one or two teachers who are not required anywhere are transferred to diets, because they have either fought with people, and that's the kind of an anecdotal story that I could get. This may not be true, but that is how they all responded to, because, the Department of Education, the chief was not happy with me, so he transferred me here and so on and so forth. All kinds of. The diets have the responsibility for creating teachers, and that is where we have a serious shortage of qualified teachers in this country. We may have had so many B.Eds. I don't doubt the number. But I can seriously say that there is a serious shortage of qualified, meaningful teachers in this country, right? And that cannot happen unless and until we restructure the diets. If we are thinking that Azim Premji Foundation will create diets, they can only train a few teachers, but they cannot replace diets. It's a massive investment which is required, and there is structure. All that we require is to, in fact, change our thinking, So we got to really intervene at the level of the diet and the teacher's trainer. You may not build, grand auditoriums for his children. What you got to have is to appoint a teacher. You have to ensure teacher, and I'm ending it up with one statement which J.P. Nayak made in his book, Indian Education, Quality, Quantity, and Equality, an Elusive Triangle, which he wrote in 60s, and he writes that this is a triangle which has never met. We are still distant from equality. Why we are distant from equality? Because quantity itself is a problem. And I disagree with him. Quantity is not a problem. We have so many children to attend schools that is never a problem. The problem is that we have created so many institutions where nothing happens, because we have distributed the benefits so thinly. अगर भूख लगी हो, हम आप सबको एक एक रोटी दे दें, तो आप थोड़ी देर बाद फिर कहेंगे भूख लग गई. That's not going to help you. That's not going to satisfy your hunger. So what is the way out? The way out is, I'll take 2 more minutes, is to map schools. And we, as a geographer, we do mapping. So we did mapping of 5 major states. And the outcome is that all these 5 states can support a system where children can be brought to a school by some kind of a transport system. It has already started. In Tamil Nadu, the average distance that a child travels in rural area is 7.5 kilometers. In Delhi, the average distance a child travels from school to home and return is close to about 12.5 kilometers. In Punjab, because of the rural-urban intermixture, you really don't know where urban ends and the rural begins, because it is a continuum now. Like you have a continuum in Kerala. The urban and the rural, they coalesce. And they are all along the canal or the river or the road lines. That is what has happened in Punjab. That is what has begun to happen in Rajasthan. That is what has started happening, and it has already started, it is happening in Haryana. So if you can perhaps strengthen the transport system, as it is, the buses are plying, but they are plying and the children are being transported in crowded buses, and every 6 months one bus meets with a kind of a fatal accident. If we regulate this entire system, we will perhaps be in a position to have fewer schools, not as many schools, but have a rational distribution of teachers, much more intensive investment of resources, better quality of education. That is the point that I am trying to propose. But this is not going to be politically correct statement. I mean, this is not going to be liked by people, by politicians. And it will be also opposed by the people, because who are the people at the grassroots level? Who is going to oppose it? Those who are going to oppose it are the members of the VEC, whose children themselves are not studying in that school. I am picking up this study of one of my students has just completed a study of West Bengal, which has had a very strong tradition of Panchayati Raj movement, which in fact brought about Operation Barga. In that kind of a situation, most of the VEC members, the dignified VEC, influential VEC members, were not sending their children to the same school, so they had no stake. They had to take all the decisions where they did not have any stake. So we got to really think in terms of rethinking about the VEC. Why create so many structures over and over again? There was teacher, parent-teacher associations. That didn't work, so we had village education committee. That didn't work, so we had a school development committee. That will not work, so we'll have something else tomorrow, and I can assure you something is already brewing. So someday you will hear something else also. Exactly on the lines that, okay, the government schools are no good because, my driver's son is also studying in the same school, so I must have a school of a, So we had to be from a third class has been removed, so second class, no good, first class, executive class. So we had gradations of schools in this country, and this is how it evolved. And I tell you, the best advantages of transport-supported educational attainment can be seen if you could study the missionary schools in the tribal areas. How could they achieve so much? Study the tribal schools, the missionary schools in the tribal areas, whatever may have been the motive. If they could achieve the results, they could really transform life, they could take education to the tribal children without having to take a school to their homes. You have to make them learn, and that is the objective, rather than have so many schools open. So we got to really go beyond RTE. We got to really examine the kind of a political dynamics which in fact it carries. And these are some of the instances of the political dynamics that I stated, which has not resulted into any significant outcome. It has certainly meant a few crores, which has been spent, few thousand crores year after year, without much benefits accruing to the people. The process of segmentation or segmented education continues. What will stop that will have to be thought over. Thank you very much for your very patient listening. But if you have questions, I'll be very happy to respond to them.
See, I have two questions when we think.
Go ahead.
Okay, sir. I have two questions. First, actually, in local governance, it has been seen that the priority is not given on, what is the learning outcome rather than building infrastructure. Because building infrastructure can be easily seen and it can become political. So how do you see the possibility of when, the substantive learning outcomes may be a political matter in a local governance? Do you see any chance that might, what you talked about? Students have passed. I have seen, students who have passed metric with 70% marks. They do not know how to write an application. The reason is that the government has to produce data to show and to claim some certain sort of legitimacy that they are ruling, they are giving educations to the population. So my question is here that, do you see, here really governmentality works in really antithetical to what the constitutional aspiration of providing education is? So,
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So my pertaining to the second question, that my question is, how this kind of approach that government takes to understand education can be changed or something.
The outcomes should change only when you take decisions, correct decisions, and you have to take tough decisions. The only way that I can see is that the kind of decline that we see will have to be stopped, especially in terms of the learning outcomes of the children, by doing two things. One, which I suggested out of my my own research, is that you have to do away with the multi-stage classrooms. Right? That is one. And you have to ensure that there is minimum number of qualified teachers, who are trained and qualified in the school. The third, which can be seen, which can be added, is that, as it is, the children are not supposed to be held back in any class, promotion will have to be granted. This is now a provision. Nobody can hold a child back until a certain stage. Okay, I have no problem. But then you will have to, in fact, supplement it with a kind of a system which is presently referred to as the comprehensive evaluation process. The comprehensive evaluation process is something, which is not based on tests, but it's based on the evaluation of the child or evaluation of the teacher about the child, and, the kind of overall development of the child, you see, which will have to be integrated into the curriculum. And this is, I think, if I remember my own childhood, for 3 years that I was in a school in your Patna, if you are from Patna, called St. Michael's, and for 3 years that I was there, they didn't have a system of annual or half-yearly examination. They had this C, continuous evaluation, and every week there used to be evaluation of children, and their parents were being sent a card. If it was a yellow card, it was unsatisfactory performance. It was a pink card, it was a very satisfactory performance. White card, fair performance. And every child will thus be evaluated by the group of teachers, and if there is a special attention that is required, the child will be, attended to separately. So the entire class did well. I mean, the entire class, I would say, had something that is happening at the +2 level where a large number of them have 95 plus in the CBSE. So that is the method. I mean, you've got to really think in terms of replacing or instituting a kind of a methodology of evaluation where you are in a position to assess the achievements of the children. The child may be very good in sports, may not be very good in certain other areas of academics, right? That has to be just. So the outcome will have to be based on these 3 important decisions: CEC, I mean, what they call it, continuous, and CCE. Is that what they call CCE? And I think several state governments are working on this. NCRT is also working on this. So I think tomorrow there will be some good outcome of this. Happening in the state governments, I'm not very happy with that. So it is being reduced to a kind of multiple choice questions and all that. Again, some kind of a testing system. Now, the government works because, I mean, you answered the question yourself. This is how the government works. And I think, but then there are alternatives to that. It cannot just continue this way. What will happen is that the mainstream government school and the stream which in fact is supported by the government will simply become a kind of an institution where nobody goes, and the private schools will be the only alternative. That is the greatest danger that we are seeing, which will exclude a large number of people who are from the lower income brackets, as it has already begun happening among those who are in the +2 levels. There is this process of income-based exclusion, which has started happening in the higher education because of large number of privatization which has occurred in professional courses, right? So like today you have professional courses for a certain number of people. You have, one thing which also needs to be looked into is that large number of our rural higher secondary and secondary schools, they do not even have science as a stream. This is an interesting observation. Perhaps most of us have been ignoring it. But this is the reality. Most of the rural higher secondary schools, they do not have science classes, majority of them. In fact, according to my estimate, and that estimate is based on a very small sample, only about 20% had science departments or science teachers at the higher secondary level. So 80% of them are already wedded to the fact that they will have to do social sciences. So the option is not available. Equality of opportunity, the very basis of the constitutional provision, is being violated by the state itself. The fact that the state itself has violated the very constitutional requirement of creating equitable opportunities for education has been violated here. And in spite of RTE being there, it continues to be violated.
It's not really a question, more of a comment. We've been visiting government schools quite regularly during the course of our semester. And we visited a lot of schools which were very well equipped with teachers. and they were extremely qualified as well. The major problem which was coming up in those setups was half the time, 3 of them had to go for government trainings, some were running deworming programs which the government had issued, some were working as election officers. So even though they were equipped and well trained, they were just not getting the time to actually enter their classroom and teach the children. They were involved in these other activities most of the time. So just
Yeah, you are absolutely right. In fact, there has been this has been going on for I don't know since when. It's not only election duty. Even when agricultural census is carried out, they are given the same responsibility. When the population census is carried out, they are given the responsibility. When the livestock census is carried out, then they are given this responsibility. Now, some of these censuses have become far more frequent. So you have this problem. And now this is a genuine problem but then, we have also learned, this I can tell you because I come from a family of teachers. Half of the ladies in my family, they are teachers, and my grandfather was a teacher, my father was a teacher, and I'm also a teacher, unfortunately or fortunately. And that becomes, and when it becomes a kind of alibi for not working, that is where the problem is. They are not doing this task 365 days. They could be doing it for, say, about 60 to 70 days or 80 days. The average number of days that the school function or should function in this country is close to about 170 to 190 days. If it has functioned for so many days, then you have delivered it. I'll just quote a kind of an instance from a work done by Malcolm Gladwell. If there is a work that he did, Outliers, that is on American society, and he brings in this notion of 10,000 hours. He says that if you have to excel, you must put in 10,000 hours. Now he takes the case of school, and he says how many number of hours that the child must do at the primary level at. And finally he comes to the conclusion that there is no substitute to hard work, that the child will have to be in a school, the children who stayed in a school for nearly about 7+, irrespective of the age, did wonders. They did well. Instead of those who went to very good schools, who came from very good background and had a record of good academic performance. A study which he quotes there is a kind of a 25 years long study by a psychologist, where the psychologist was trying to measure the subsequent lifelong experiences of those who were considered to be Nobel materials. They were likely to perhaps win Nobel Prize. Only 2 out of those 25 got Nobel Prize. 23 out of them could reach in nowhere. They ended up as bank accountants. But all those in the non-control group, who in fact were nowhere, they could reach much higher levels. That is precisely because of the input that was put in. So perhaps the government will have to realize this, and the teachers will also have to realize. They have to perhaps understand that they have the greatest responsibility of looking after their students. In Norwegian countries, in Scandinavian countries, it's difficult to become a teacher than to become a doctor. 1 out of 100 could become a doctor, 1 out of 1,000 becomes a teacher. Not because they are not willing to, but because the process of making a teacher is extremely difficult. So when we take alibi, I know of my colleagues, this year I'm really tired, I was engaged in, they're all, we know, we do go around and say, what is being said these days is that this midday meal is the biggest culprit in North Bihar, in North India. Unfortunately, there was a problem in Bihar, in my district, very close to my village. I'm also from Bihar. What shall we do? Stop midday meals? Look at the experiences of the southern states. They were in a position to, in fact, achieve a very high level of retention. Not because of the midday meals alone, but because of corrective actions that they brought in. They also, their teachers also were engaged in livestock census, in agricultural census. But why this differential outcomes? There is somewhere, there is a serious problem. We don't have right kind of people in teaching. Those who could get in nowhere became teachers. So there is no wonder, a BA pass cannot write an application because his teacher also cannot write an application. What are we really talking about?
We are discussing about the policies and all the things. And you have quoted so many things. I just want to ask one or two from that. Does really policies matter? In the example you are quoted that diets. There are so many states who don't even existence of diet like Bihar also. And at the same time, you have quoted that about the Sant Michael's school strategy. So does it really matter? Are the St. Michael's school managements or teacher has got training from the diet who are managed to do such a nice things?
Yeah, that is why I talked about governance. That is where I talked about governance. Your colleague only talked about the fact that she went to several schools. Government schools you were talking about, the teachers were good, but they were unable to perform the task because they were engaged elsewhere. I take that as a kind of a basis to develop my argument. The point that I'm really trying to put forward is that the nature of governance in the school, whether it is private school or a government school, is very, very essential. And how you really govern the school system, how many times you really, when I'm talking governance, I'm not only talking of the head teacher. I'm not talking in terms of the hierarchy alone. I'm talking about the process. In JNU, we have a process which really works and which works wonders. We have this weekly faculty meeting. In weekly faculty meeting, what we discuss so many things, we also fight. But, one thing that we constantly discuss is who are the students whose performances are not very good. And why is it so? So the purpose is to, in fact, work extra time with those students. So we have, what we call it, the corrective programs for that. If somebody is weak in statistics, we give them extra classes in statistics. If somebody is weak in English, we give them extra classes in English. We attach a student in the English department to work with that student. So all these are which we call remedial courses. So, but then this is not built into the statutes of Jawaharlal Nehru University. Jawaharlal Nehru University statutes look absolutely the same as the Delhi University statute or Bangalore University statute. It is the process at the department level which really makes the difference. And that is why I talked about St. Michael's. That is why I talked about, I have seen several schools, in Punjab also when I was visiting and working with them, that wherever there were these processes were being carried out in whatever manner, the results were better, whether they were government schools or private schools, right? So one has to see as to what processes are there. So policies matter at one level, how things are conducted at the school level are also important. So they both must supplement each other.
My next question is that you have mentioned that dropout rates in several states, right? And you have mentioned that the dropout rates are higher even in the developed states, right? Gujarat or in the Punjab, they are much lesser. So is it because of the children leaving the school, or is it because of the children transferring the school from the government school to the private schools? What's data said exactly?
The data, you see, the dropout rates are worked out in a certain fashion where demographically, if you work it out, then you take into consideration a whole lot of things. That is, we also take into consideration the age-specific death rates at the local level. But this data that I'm talking about is at the state level. That means the possibility of children moving out of school from one state to another state may constitute just not even 1.001% of the total population of children who in fact are getting transferred from one place to another. You are getting my point? So the possibility of transfers affecting the figure is ruled out because I'm talking at the aggregate level. This could happen at the village level. If I'm talking about the dropout rates in a particular village, and if the child is not de jure there, de facto there, that means if the child is present in that village but not enrolled, one can say the child is out of school. The child is present in the village, not attending classes, one can say the child is not currently attending classes. But if the child is not there in the village, there is a possibility that the child may have gone to some other school. So only at the village level that there can be larger elements of error. But when we are talking at the state level, the error factor is very, very minimal. Statistically.
But that village level data accumulate the state level data, right?
Yes, but then, if you are moved out from one village to another village within the state, you are recorded as admitted or not admitted. You're getting my point? So that is not the issue at all. There is enough care to work out dropout rates. It is not as bad as life expectancy data on life expectancy, because what we see in the name of life expectancy is not life expectancy, it is average age at which people die. That is not life expectancy, but we still quote it as life expectancy. That is the average age of all those who had died. So in a population which is aging, aging population means, as our society is aging, my great-grandfather died at a much younger age and I'm still alive, Now, if that happens, then, the life expectancy would get distorted, that kind of a distortion is not there and other things remaining the same. We are using the same measure to define dropout rates in West Bengal, in Bihar, and in Gujarat, right?
Yeah, thanks for a wonderful talk and bringing out how our education system is deepening the inequality. Actually, I just want to point your attention to some other factors also. You told, like, if you enable transportation or enable better governance, we can see some kind of improvement in the government school, especially in the output of.
Yeah. I can hear you anyway.
I did my study in Kerala, I come from Kerala. Kerala is a state that has several of this good infrastructure, good teachers, there is no teacher absenteeism, and several...
Very low, yeah.
Very low. Several of the things that the policymakers dream is truly happening in Kerala, but still we can see a huge dropout of children in the government schools. And also what we can see in Kerala is a mushrooming of private schools. I went to a small town where I personally went and counted almost 132 private schools. But you look at the educational statistics of Kerala, in that small town, you can see only 7 to 8 schools in the educational statistics. And another thing, in all these schools, there are a lot of children studying also. And I went to a particular government school for my research study, and this was a school that has almost 4,000 children during the 80s, which declined during the 90s. And after the DPP and the activity-oriented curriculum being implemented in 2000s, you can see children's number coming to 800, and in 2008, it come to 400. Now, there are less than 100 children studying in the school. Last week, I went to the school. What is the scenario is, children from the ashram shalas or the tribal schools from a hilly area is being transferred to this school so that all the teachers, the teacher positions will be maintained. And this is a very recent phenomena happening in several of the aided schools in Kerala also. The tribal children are being transferred to aided schools in towns from first standard. Actually, these tribal children are never allowed to take from their habitat before fifth standard, but the aided schools want to maintain the teacher vacancies, so the tribal children are moved and their accommodation is being provided. So what I want to indicate is we also have to see these kind of curricular differentiation or the segmentation also happening in terms of curriculum. The curricular differentiation happening, and also what the parents aspire for. The parents aspire for an English education. Not only that, that also prepare children to tackle the competitive exams that gives them social mobility, which presently the CBSE or the ICSE or the international schools are catering to. So the government school dropout needs to also be seen in relation to this phenomena of what private schools are offering. And now it is interestingly, the Kerala curriculum is also moving, saying, the state curriculum, we will provide a vocational education. State is being so realistic, who is the, clients of government schooling? If you are coming from a marginalized group, we will provide you vocational education. So this is not only being seen in the curriculum, even the textbook and the teaching learning process is moving towards that. So I do not know if we take some insights from Kerala, this kind of bringing in infrastructure facilities or transportation, whether those things are going to bring in better equality. So as long as we have these differential schools with differential curriculum, catering to different sections, then it's much more complex question.
In fact, I was precisely referring to these tendencies. And I'm aware of the certain parts of Kerala because last year I worked among the Adians in Manandwadi Tehsil of, what is that, Wayanad district. I worked among them. I also stayed in an ashram school in the same Anandwadi. One of the girls of that ashram school got the President's Award just about 2 years back for having done excellent work in that school itself. You are right that the Kerala has a very strong tradition and they have done pretty well on the educational front, but it is not simply the government initiative, it has also been the private initiative in Kerala. That's the history can be seen. Anyway, without going into that, Kerala has also undergone, not only in the tribal areas, but elsewhere also is undergoing some kind of a demographic transition. And that demographic transition has also resulted in lower number of children. Let me complete. I mean, it's not only just talking about, I got your point. But the demographic transition, that is the lowest fertility rates, translates into number of children going to school or who are likely to enter the school-going age group. And thus, it is likely to have impact on the number of schools, right? This is not a new development which we have seen. In fact, about 8 years ago, Kerala government decided to close down some of the schools and transfer the children as well as the teachers also. Differential curriculum is something which I'm against. I mean, I said that there has to be a one uniform curriculum. But whatever differentiation that you can bring about can be at the level of practices, at the level of pedagogy, at the level of whatever that is locally suited. One point that I said, which I did not mention, but that was just a kind of a, which we need to, which is there in the paper that we are preparing, is the fact that you can have this kind of a transport-aided schools and relocation of the schools as long as the specific characteristics of the population and the area doesn't get adversely affected. That means I'm talking about areas where you have very, very low density of population. The less dense areas are likely to suffer and they're likely to be deprived out of this. Say, for example, the areas of the Thar Desert, where you have very low density of population, you will have to take schools then to them, rather than carrying them all over to schools because the transport situation is not good. So therefore, you have to have a common curriculum. You can bring about whatever changes in the, yes, the vocationalization is very important. I think, we got to really talk about introducing vocationalization at the middle level itself, and and what would be the nature of vocational studies is something that will have to be thought over, I'm not for, reinforcing gender and caste-based kind of vocational training. So I should not be misunderstood. Although in case of Kerala, perhaps you are from Kerala and you must have seen that, there is a gender divide at the level of higher education, professional education. So yes, I mean, the situation is not very rosy in spite of the fact that, the state has been doing pretty well. The dropout, the point that you were saying is dropout from a school and being sent to another school is not again based on the school dropout. I mean, all these factors are taken into consideration. That doesn't reveal the dropout, but there are tendencies in the urban areas of Kerala where the dropout rates have started increasing. This is a disturbing phenomenon. Like, the areas which are closer to the cotton belt in Gujarat, the dropout rates become high in a certain season. So if you try to gather accounts on seasonality, and then, the time when the cotton is to be picked, the children are withdrawn from school because it means good money to the family, So that is also seen at the time of harvest, at certain specific agricultural operations in different parts of the country. At the time in the area of Wayanad, when what is that, black pepper and all those things will have to be collected from the forest, children are also involved, especially I know the two communities living there in the forest, they send their children, and during that period they are not going to school. So maybe, you can reorient your cycle of school, your calendar of school, depending upon the local needs, not that I want to promote child labor, no, I should not be seen talking in those terms, but something, which is part and parcel of the society. Something, which you have not been in a position to, you cannot really thus say that, okay, no school during this time because the school calendar is different from the agricultural or whatever cycle of life that they have. I think, if we gel the two, then, the outcomes can be interesting.
I just want to clarify what I think about this. The demographic transition in Kerala is all the time being projected as a reason for government school dropout, which is true, as you said. But we are also seeing an increase in number of private schools. So
let me correct you. The private school, the government schools, the data is being collected from both. The problem is where, I mean, if you take a look at the DIAS latest data, the coverage of the private schools have increased massively, So, that error component is declining. The problem with the problem is with the unrecognized schools, private schools, because, they are very difficult to be located. They could be in one of the streets and so on and so forth. So that is where the problem is. But then if you adjust it at the village level, I think, it can still be, this dropout rates that we are talking about is still very good. But you don't have to worry in case of Kerala, because the dropout rate in Kerala isn't very high at the primary and upper primary level.
But what I worry is whether the public education system will remain, whether the government schools will close down. And
That is, yes, that's the point which I said in my lecture also. I said that this is the tendency which is picking up. You see, earlier in early mid-90s, the only phenomenon of private schooling was urban-based, metropolitan-based, up to 1995. What happens after 1995? Two states emerge as the leaders in private education. Punjab being one, Delhi and its surrounding being, the NCR being another. And after 2000, you see this tendency is spreading all over, right? So for government also it is good because, they see that they will not have to set up schools. But that really doesn't happen. They are, if you look at the statistics, in fact, about 67,000 schools were added ever since SSA started. 67,000 schools have been added. But these 67,000 schools are being added in order to show that we have achieved this. Actually, the schools are without teachers because we don't have teachers. Or even if there are teachers, the government is not appointing teachers. I mean, where has been, you see, the attrition rate, that means retirement of the school teachers is increasing year after year. Is the recruitment keeping pace with the attrition rates in schools? No. There is a huge gap. The answer is that there will be no education in these schools, ye band ho jayenge. Private schools chalega. That is the political economy. You pay and you get education.
Hello, hi, good evening. Thank you for your talk. I had a comment and a quick question after that. My comment was, you mentioned teachers, comparing Norway and India, for example, and you said that teachers there are 1 in 1,000 get selected. So based on that comment and taking off from Gladwell's outliers that you mentioned, 10,000 hours, my follow-up question is, what would you say one of your recommendations perhaps to structure incentives at the institutional level so that the right kind of people get attracted to education? Because I completely take your point that I think getting to become a teacher is just too easy in this country. It should be the most difficult profession to get into.
True. Yeah, I mean, I'm all for incentives. Say, for example, but then I have a question, which I will put it across to the floor, is that, until about 5th Pay Commission, the central government teachers were not being paid so very well. The 5th Pay Commission and the 6th Pay Commission really raised their salary. It has certainly meant that, our lives have become so very good. Has it really resulted into better outcomes? No, it hasn't. So therefore, there is much beyond the incentives that we'll have to. We'll have to, in fact, do something in order to attract, as you were saying, the best minds to this profession. And for that, you need to really make this profession look like something for which, people would aspire for. Let me give you an example. When we talk about the best of the engineering colleges, we know the names of the best of the engineering colleges. When we talk about law colleges, we know the name of the law colleges and the law universities. If you want to send your younger brother for masters in business administration, he knows what he has to aspire for the best. Can I ask you a question, sir? If somebody wants to become a teacher, where he would like to go and seek education or become a teacher? There is not one college in this country with that status, with that reputation. That means, to begin with, we have been neglecting this. And 60s, things were still better. 70s started declining when we started promoting, B.Ed courses through correspondence. B.Ed courses through correspondence made universities and colleges rich and the schools poor. So I think, we have to work, and that's where I was saying that we'll have to work at the level of training teachers. Make it a far more, I don't see as to why there has to be so much of a stipend given to people doing PhD. 18,000 rupees. I see my students, enjoying their life and doing little research because they have plenty of money. 3 people could have been given the same amount. 18,000 divided by 3 would have been very good for them. But since they come from a certain class, and that class will have to be appeased. That is where, you have 18,000. Why can't a teacher who wants to aspire to become a B.Ed be given a stipend of that kind? What is the stipend that a B.Ed student gets? Can anybody tell me? I don't know. No stipend. So where do we think, there is no promotion. The government policies are are not promoting this particular segment at all. When things were becoming worse, the government decided all of a sudden that they will open 30 B.Ed colleges. Again, another invention. The old colleges were not doing better, so create new colleges. I mean, this is what we have done every time. Have 12 more central universities. How is that going to change the situation in this country? The existing colleges are starving of funds. The existing universities, the state universities, are starving of funds. You want to create a new college, new university. How is that going to change? And has it really changed things? Because most of these private universities, most of these new central universities, they do not even have, half of them, rather 70% of them, they do not even have tenure appointed teachers. They have contract teachers. What kind of quality education are they likely to provide? I'm asking, I put it across to you, but I fully agree that there will have to be incentives. And incentives will have to be brought in at an early level so that it attracts people. At least that there would be an option. For ITIs, there were stipends. Yeah.
That structuring incentives, you mentioned research, PhD research students, perhaps we differ on that. I really do believe there is a paucity in terms of structuring incentives at the PhD level because research output is necessary for a developing country like India, and innovation comes through that, I believe. So incentives are probably rightly structured, but they are not inbuilt into the curriculum that gets students to think in a research-oriented mindset.
Absolutely, because that is where I would say 18 instead of 18,000, as a kind of a pocket expenditure. Had we said, okay, your annual contingency grant is raised from 5,000 rupees to 10,000, from 10,000 to 20,000, that would be a much better option, which will give a much better outcome. But let me tell you where these JNU pockets a fairly large number of UGC fellowships every year. And I cannot publicly say, but it is being recorded, so I can't. But I don't mind saying this, that even they are in social sciences, humanities, they failed to spend that 5,000 rupees in any productive way. I know of science students doing little better, only a little better, because they have to buy chemicals. So incentives will have to be built in the right way. I fully agree with you. Yeah.
What should be an area for teachers, government teachers, to get promotion? How we can measure his outcomes?
I don't know. Frankly speaking, I cannot answer this because I haven't worked in this area at all. I'm basically a geographer. I work in the area of how certain infrastructures are distributed and not beyond that. Yeah. I'm not tired, Shaswati. If you are tired, you may leave. I'm not tired. So every state has its own system. It varies, called the efficiency bar or something like that. That they have to also increase their what do you call it, educational profile. What is now being made part and parcel of SSA is again something which many states take pride of, but I think that is not to be so taken that way with any element of pride, is that the student, the class monitor, will also mark attendance and will submit a report saying as to what the teacher taught on a certain day. Now, this again is a class monitor and there is a class teacher. So it is negotiated between the monitor and the teacher. The outcome is 100% good. So that's only a kind of an eye wash. That is what I saw in Punjab. That is the state that I studied a little more closely.
Thank you for the talk, sir. I am from Ludhiana. In Ludhiana, there are some areas which are loaded with small schools, and they are quite a large number. And because of that, the students are distributed in among the schools, and no school have enough number of students. And that's why school have a problem as a money rating problem. They don't recruit good teachers. So how can we solve this problem? Because there are students which are distributed among the schools, and because of that, there is a financial crisis among schools also.
You see, what we all know is that, we are not going to send our children to any school. This is a decision which is taken by rich and poor with a lot of care. To say that, the nearest school is going to be the option, the best option, is not always true. My fieldwork says that, the poorest of the lot in the village also aspired to send their children, send his or her child to a school which was publicly seen as a good school, right? So let this private recognize or unrecognize the schools wither away if they can't manage financially, right? The only way that I see is that, if you strengthen infrastructure, if you strengthen at least, the teaching process in the government schools, and wherever it has happened, it has given good dividends. I'll give you the latest example. Until about 2004, Delhi government-run schools were not receiving children of people who were in regular services, class 2, class 1 or above. That means what happened is that the government-run Delhi government schools only had class 3 and class 4 employees children, right? Now when the articulate section withdraws, then the section, the parental pressure to demand better education also declines, and thus the school starts declining in its performance. The teachers were the same. So one lady who became the head of the SIRT, or she was become head of the Department of Education, I know the lady's name, Janaki, and I had the opportunity of working with her for about a year and a half. That was in 2006, 2007 in Delhi. She started doing something very innovative in these schools. She picked up few schools in every locality, not all government schools. When she started doing better, these schools started doing better, the class 2, class 1, parents who were in class 1 jobs and class 2 jobs in residential, government residential localities, they started withdrawing their children from, the private schools, and they started re-enrolling their children in government schools. You will see it in Punjab also. You are from Ludhiana, so you will see that there is the first option is to send child to an English medium private school at the primary level. Am I wrong? Okay. The second is that once the child starts doing better, then the child goes to a government school in the Mufassil town. If you are from Ludhiana, then a little away from Ludhiana, there is another urban center, maybe a Mandi town, where there are few private schools and a well, I may not remember, while walking, this was, you can pick up any example. You can pick up the statistics of the Punjab government, and you see that, suddenly the enrollment in high and higher secondary schools in the government segment increases. That means children who are graduating from upper primary in the private sector, they are again coming back to government schools. Because government schools, it's very difficult to, in fact, foot the bill in the private sector at the secondary and higher secondary level. They are very, very expensive. Some of them are extremely expensive. The good ones are very expensive. In Ludhiana and surrounding, you require nearly about 70,000 rupees per annum, for sending one child to a private school, while it is not even 700 for a government school. So that is where, this shift takes place. Because there is an average earning of of the rural areas. So people who could afford it in the earlier stages may not afford it for higher education, because the difference between the upper primary fees and the higher secondary fees is enormous. It is 20,000 per annum to 70,000 per annum. 50,000 gap है, तो उसमें वो shift होता है. But quality of education का भी shift होता है. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you too much, Professor. And thank you all. Actually, I went back to my JNU days. I used to attend his classes just to listen to him, just to learn something from him. I don't know how many PhD supervisors give so much of time to discuss one research question for hours together. So I remember those days of my life. And thank you, sir. Thank you so much. On behalf of our university, thanks to Professor Sachidanand Sinha. And I hope you enjoyed the session. And thank you all. Okay.